My name is Louis, and I'm a Member of Parliament for Sengkang GRC under the Workers' Party. The public housing market, or HDB market, has been a key feature of the Singapore story. And here in Singapore, more than 80% of Singaporeans actually reside in HDB flats. But as they say, past performance may not be indicative of the future. While the model has served us well, we are increasingly seeing a bit of a dilemma faced by Singaporeans when it comes to public housing. Over the next series of videos, myself and the Workers' Party will take you through some of these issues which we have identified for the public housing market, as well as put forth some solutions which we have proposed to try to address some of these issues before they become out of hand. To begin with, if you think about the public housing market, what exactly is the dilemma which we are facing today? So on the one hand, you have young Singaporeans who are increasingly facing challenges with getting on the property ladder, finding that HDB flats may not be all that affordable anymore. For one, if you look at public housing prices over the last 3 years, they've increased by more than 30%, even outpacing the level of price increases which we have seen in the private residential market at about more than 20%. On the other hand, if you look at the existing stock of HDB flats, our older Singaporeans who are increasingly relying on their primary property, their HDB flat, for their retirement, may find that this valuable retirement nest egg will get eroded with the passage of time. So you have affordability on one hand, and on the other hand, retirement adequacy at the heart of the issue. So why is this a problem then? If you think about the fundamentals of the public housing market, a model which is built on ever-appreciating prices just simply cannot be sustainable. Even though we say that, look, our HDB flats are an appreciating asset, increasingly, there is also the issue of the 99-year lease, where if all else goes according to plan, then the higher the prices go, then the harder the fall. Because eventually, what goes up must come down. So at the same time, you can think about the public housing stock today as, okay, Singapore is not that old a country. Is this a problem that is far out in the future? Actually, if you look at the stock of flats today, we are increasingly seeing a lot of public housing estates which are built in the 70s, coming close to the 50-year mark. Yes, public housing prices may continue to increase at this point in time because of the nature of the market today, of the demand-supply imbalance which we are seeing. But increasingly, this is one whereby the value of the flats will get eroded rapidly as we approach the tail end of the lease. Now, this is not a problem which we should continue to kick the can down the road. And in fact, knowing the issue today, we should address the root cause of the issue and nip the problem at its bud. And this is something which we have witnessed here in 𝗟𝗲𝘁 in the recent 𝗧𝗹𝗸 project, or the Selective En Bloc Redevelopment Scheme, whereby the older estates, if they are identified for 𝗧𝗹, will actually be sold back to the government at a certain compensation. Now, in the past, when people think of 𝗧𝗹, they kind of think of a windfall from an en bloc project, just like a private residential market. However, this compensation is actually based on the market value of the flats at the point in time in which they have been identified for 𝗧𝗹. So as the flats continue to age and the value of the remaining lease continues to run down, we may find ourselves in a situation whereby the compensation provided by 𝗧𝗹 is actually coming down as the value of the remaining lease continues to be diminished. Yet at the same time, you have new BTO flats which are priced at a premium compared to some of these older flats. So we are already seeing a widening disparity between the older HDB flats and the newer BTO flats. And this is a problem which we may see happening on a much more larger scale as a lot of all these mature estates, be it Toa Payoh, 𝗟𝗟𝘁, Queenstown, Marine Parade, start to reach the end of their lease in the near future. Now, for the vast majority of the public housing market, if nothing changes, then the value of the HDB flats will simply go to zero. But even for those which are selected for 𝗧𝗹, residents may be faced with a tough choice of perhaps selecting a flat with a less ideal location, a shorter lease tenure, or perhaps even downsizing from a larger flat to a smaller flat. Now that we've explored the various dilemmas faced by the public housing market today, the big question to ask then is, how did we even get here in the first place? Do keep a lookout for the next episode where we'll explore this issue further.
The goal of HDB at the time was always to ensure both accessibility and affordability.
Why so messy?
Why so messy?
Why so messy? Why so messy?
Why so messy?
Hi, I'm 𝗟𝗲𝘁. Welcome back. In the previous episode, Lewis had explained to us about the fundamental tension between the need to appreciate house prices in order to ensure retirement adequacy versus the need to keep housing affordable, especially for those who are just entering the housing market and stepping on that housing ladder. In order to get a better understanding of all that has transpired, I think it's useful for us to look at history. So here I am sitting at Sterling Road in Queenstown, which is one of the original first few blocks that HDB built. Now, of course, back in the time, this amounted to a few $1,000s, which, to be fair, for incomes of the time, was still significant. Nevertheless, the goal of HDB at the time was always to ensure both accessibility and affordability. What do I mean by accessibility? Well, importantly, HDB was conceived with the objective of moving a large part of what was squatters in the central areas off to what was then the edges of Singapore town. Because of the need to do so quickly, the design of these flats were relatively simple. And you can see behind me, they were usually built with a single common corridor. They only extended up to 7 floors. And importantly, they were put up in a relatively rapid fashion. Today, of course, we know that housing takes a significantly longer time in order for the construction to be completed. While we are assured that wait times could be as little as 1 to 2 years after the BTO, many of us know friends and family members that have had to wait for as long as 5, 6, or 7 years after registering their interest. The other element of HDB was affordability. What you can see behind me, of course, is the original flats, but just down the road, you will see Dawson. Dawson, notably, is one of those areas in Singapore where flats used to cost, at the time of launch, about $600,000. Unfortunately now, it's much closer to $1 million in the resale market. From these first initial housing projects in the 1960s, the objectives for public housing were wildly successful. Recall, the initial objectives were to resolve the housing crisis and to ensure that the masses of the Singaporean population were safely in public housing. As it turns out, thereafter, from an initial share of just around 8.8% housed in these public flats, we were able to raise this to something in excess of 80% of the population. Having resolved so much of these initial objectives of housing the public, HDB then turned its eye into other goals. This is just about when the Asset Enhancement Program came into place. In the 1990s, Singapore experienced a construction and property boom. House prices between 1990 and 1996 rose by more than threefold. In order to meet this demand, HDB started building all over the island. Unfortunately, as many of us know, in 1997 we had the Asian financial crisis. Prices of all assets, including housing, collapsed. As a result, HDB was left with a large stock of housing at the time. It was also during this time that HDB then introduced the so-called built-to-order flats, or BTOs. BTOs ensured that HDB wouldn't be left with massive unsold supply because flats would only be built on demand. As a consequence of these policies, many Singaporeans came to expect that their house prices would move in only one direction, up but never down. Singaporeans came to believe that their houses would in fact be a key source for their retirement. Unfortunately, in 2017, then Minister for National Development Lawrence Wong suggested that the 𝗟𝗲 program would only apply to a small fraction of HDB flats. Hence, for the vast majority of Singaporeans, this would not be available for their retirement incomes, and their flats would eventually expire with a value of 0. How then does the government plan to address this conundrum? We'll talk about that in our next episode. You know, we live in Singapore where not everyone has been able to afford a home. Hey Albert, what you doing?
I'm building a city for my minifigs.
Oh, a city? So, what are the key things in your city?
The houses, because everybody deserves a place to stay where they can feel safe.
So well, I agree with that. That's really important. Everyone deserves a home. You know, we live in Singapore where not everyone has been able to afford a home.
Why is all the homes so expensive and take so long to build now?
You know, Albert, that is actually a much deeper question than you might even think. So let me explain. Hi, welcome back. We're here at Rivervale Shores. It's one of the newest BTO projects, as it turns out, in Sengkang, the GRC that's represented by the Workers' Party. Residents at this estate are just collecting their keys, but many of us may be aware that there has been a long gestation period, 6 years for many families. Part of the reason, of course, was due to COVID, but part of the reason was due to a supply shortfall that has blighted the entire island. We're here to think more carefully about the existing public housing model, of how the HDB builds, prices, and sells, and to ask, is there an alternative way? The first point to think about is how we build. The current model for HDB is a build-to-order model, where HDB, in theory, would only build the required number of units when there's a clear, sufficient demand. We think that this existing model is not entirely fit for purpose. One reason was revealed by COVID-19. Of course, nobody anticipated COVID-19 and the kind of shock that it would imply. But what that did was it led to long waits of an additional 3, 4, or even 5 years for some households. We think that the government can do more in terms of building in advance. After all, household formation is largely predictable. Likewise, the population growth rate is also reasonably predictable. And of course, the government holds the levers for immigration, which therefore renders that also predictable. Even if we end up with an oversupply, the government is the one that takes on the burden of this additional stock, rather than to transfer the risk entirely to homeowners who are less able to bear the shock. Another question we can ask ourselves is how we price. Why is it that land is so expensive? As it turns out, we believe that this is because of a belief by this government that land must be priced entirely according to market principles. The challenge here, of course, is that there's no single one market for land. Land has many uses, just like how the government already prices land for commercial uses, as well as non-commercial uses differentially. The government can also consider of all the spillover benefits that exist for pricing public housing land at a sufficiently cheaper discount relative to how they price commercial land. This will ensure that the price of land doesn't get too far ahead of affordability and ultimately keeps the price of HDB flats affordable. The third question we need to ask ourselves is how we sell. Since 1964, when HDB began the process of selling flats directly to the public, the model has been one where sales were for 99-year leases. Now, the government had good intentions at the time. It wanted to encourage a sense of home ownership and rootedness to Singapore during our nation-building phase. But times have changed, and the expectations and aspirations of our people have likewise evolved. Is that 99-year model still fit for purpose? Well, we know that young people may be much more open to alternative models, such as an extended rent. And indeed, HDB has already recognized this possibility. The flexi model currently allows those above the age of 55 to purchase flats in 5-year increments up to the age of 95. Hence, it's entirely possible for those who are relatively older to buy a short lease term and prepay that for their housing. Alternative lease durations are not limited to the flexi model. In the most recent 𝗟𝗲𝗁 𝗧𝗹𝗸 exercise, it was the case that the government allowed for up to a 50-year lease period so that the headline price of purchase of those units would be more affordable. This shorter lease period is something that could be extended to a broader range of configurations, not just those apartments that are affected by 𝗧𝗹𝗫 buyouts. And finally, of course, many of us that are younger may be much more open to the idea of rentals. But rental in the open market is often unaffordable. Is it possible for the government to have a public rental scheme that is expanded, that might include the possibility of larger format homes rather than the smaller format ones that are currently available? In our next episode, join me as well as my colleague, Lewis, as we look at alternative models for Singapore housing in the 21st century. So here, what we're going to do is to try to put forward some of the Workers' Party solutions to the HDB problem. Welcome back. Well, over the past few episodes, we had the opportunity to discuss what we perceive to be some of the main problems with the existing model of HDB. So the natural question many of you would have is, well, what then are your proposed solutions? So here, what we're going to do is to try to put forward some of the Workers' Party solutions to the HDB problem.
That's right. And I think we have shared some of these in the housing paper, which was published a number of years ago, and at the same time during the parliamentary debates earlier this year as well. So one of the first solutions that we have is really the universal sale and leaseback scheme. Now, what that does is really that it allows the homeowner, the HDB homeowner, to have the option to sell the flat back to the HDB. So in so doing, the HDB then becomes a buyer of last resort, and that addresses one of the key issues with the 99-year lease decay problem. And so by providing the backstop to valuations, by having the HDB being a buyer of last resort, I think that provides some stability to housing valuations.
So Louis, hearing what you're saying about buyer of last resort and selling back to HDB, the natural question many have is, this sounds a lot like the government's existing VERS scheme. So how really is it any different?
Yes, it does sound similar, but a critical difference here is that firstly, for the universal sale and leaseback scheme, the option is really at the individual homeowner level, whereas in VERS, based on the limited information that we have, it is actually subject to voting on the precinct level, again similar to your en-bloc project that you have in the private residential properties. And at the same time, I think it's really critical that because different people have different life stages, by having the individual homeowner have the option, I think that is really the key here.
And I think it's also important to stress that this is precisely the kind of situation where you want someone like the government, which has the ability to take on the risk, to actually be the ones to take on that risk of possibly doing what they need to do with an empty flat. For instance, they may choose to rent it out in an expanded public rental scheme, or they may choose to hold it on and redevelop after they have enough of that stock. They will be the ones with the capacity to take on that risk as opposed to some individual homeowner.
So we've talked about the universal sale and leaseback scheme. So James, would you like to share another suggestion that we have?
Yeah, Louis, we had already mentioned the 𝗟𝗪 plan, but many of us would of course also be familiar with the predecessor plan for the 𝗟𝗪, which was in fact 𝗟𝗪s. Now, the big difference between 𝗟𝗪s and 𝗟𝗪s, of course, is that 𝗟𝗪s arguably was relatively more generous, but we appear to be at the upper end of what the government has already stated, which is that it will apply to 5% of the existing stock. So what we are suggesting is that instead we should just go ahead and do 𝗟𝗪s for much more of the existing stock, using the existing economics that already apply to 𝗟𝗪s, and we don't see why that might not work. What do you think, Louis, are some of the reasons why the government thinks this 𝗟𝗪s cannot be sustainable in the medium run?
And I think that they've shared that the limit for the number of housing projects that can undergo 𝗟𝗪s is 5%. And as far as I recall, we are already supposedly approaching the limit of 5%. But why does this has to be the case? And I think it's also something where if you look at a lot of all these 𝗟𝗪s projects, they are the ones which are identified to have high redevelopment potential. And I think that is also where, perhaps the mature estates, that's where the projects are highly in demand by Singaporeans. And if you look at some of these older residential estates, if they are built to, let's say, 8 or 10 stories, it doesn't make sense for us to let it be the case, and we could essentially develop it with a much higher intensity, meaning to say rather than a 10-story flat, you have something which is running to 30, 40 stories. And you're already seeing this in some of the new BTO developments in 𝗟𝗂𝗪, for example.
So the part that is puzzling to me is, well, if you are going to have more intensive redevelopment, why is it that the economics doesn't quite work? Does it have to do with the fact that the government has perhaps trapped itself in the economics of land valuation and perhaps overvalued the land such that once you pay out that land, inevitably you would be in a loss-making position? So, but in terms of the actual economics, taking away the land, just tearing down an existing project and rebuilding it with more intensity, I'm sure the economics actually work out once you have a doubling or tripling of the floor.
Exactly, and I think this is where the government has also shared that 𝗟𝗪s will be less generous in terms of the payments compared to 𝗟𝗪s, and that is one of the critical differences between 𝗟𝗪s and 𝗟𝗪s. So the question then is, as what James has already shared, why can't we then have a more widespread 𝗟𝗪s program?
So a third suggestion that the Workers' Party has is to consider the possibility of having different kind of lease duration schemes. So right now, of course, most of us would be aware that you can purchase a flat, but ultimately it is for 99 years. There are some deviations from this. If you were to purchase, for instance, a flexi, it would be increments of 5 years, typically starting from 60 years, where you have to reach a 95-year threshold. What we're suggesting is, well, why don't we actually have the baseline be such that you start with a 70-year lease instead of a 99-year lease, and you provide the option of adding 29 years?
That's right, and I think that is something which is quite interesting, because if you look at the various property projects across Singapore, you have land leases of various tenures, industrial, for example, which is at 30 years, and there are also a 60-year assisted living project that was just introduced by the government at Parry Avenue. But I think one of the questions that people might have is, why have this option in the first place when the government already has a lease buyback scheme, since you can sell it back to the government?
So intuitively, if you think about it, how many of you would like to put an outlay of more than you actually need, rather than putting just what you need and having the option of extending it should you need more? For instance, you go for traveling You don't imagine booking a hotel for 2 weeks when you think you'll only be there for 10 days. You'd rather book it for 10 days and then extend it by an additional 3 or 4 days should the need arise. So that's just a first intuitive reason. 70 years also really makes sense from the perspective of individuals. Most of us, should you live in the flat from the time that you acquire it till the time that you leave this earth, do live for around 70 years in that flat. So 70 years is a very natural stopping point as opposed to the additional 29 years. And then finally, I think it's worth pointing out that lower initial outlay can really make a difference. Not only from the perspective of needing to put in less in the beginning, but also because that allows CPF to accumulate over time and fulfill its original reason, rather than have it go into your flat and then feel that the flat needs to appreciate over time. I think we had mentioned earlier on that there is a conflict between the purposes of CPF and retirement adequacy versus HDB and the need to house individuals. And so this helps us to once again separate these two institutions and keep them much more aligned with their original functions.
Indeed, and I think that really addresses the two fundamental issues that people are grappling with today. Housing affordability, whereby if you can make it more affordable, why not do that? And at the same time, safeguard retirement adequacy by not maximizing the use of your CPF savings just for your primary housing.
So Louis, when I was living abroad, one of the things that I used to do was to rent. Of course, many Singaporeans have this visceral reaction when it comes to renting. They have a sense that rental is somehow lower quality. The Workers' Party has a proposal about public housing. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and I think the initial reaction that a lot of people have will be renting is just throwing money down the drain. So I think that, if you look at the housing model in Singapore for the last, 60 plus years, we've been talking about home ownership being sort of like the Singapore story, the be-all and end-all when it comes to housing solutions for Singaporeans. But really, as you have personally experienced as well, renting can also be a viable form of housing arrangement for Singaporeans, and it need not be that home ownership is a superior model to renting. And I think that's something where people may be at different life stages at different points in time. I think for yourself, you were overseas, and does it make sense for you to commit to, let's say, a BTO flat which you will not be living in? And I think that's something which perhaps other than home ownership per se, which we have been focusing a lot on, perhaps we can also look at renting being a much more viable form of housing arrangement where the HDB can again step up to play its role as a provider of rental housing rather than just leaving it to the private market.
Okay, but the common thinking is that, well, once you allow people to rent, they don't have a sense of ownership, they don't care for the place as much. You're going to build public slums. So what do you say to that kind of objection?
So I think it's really about putting in place protections for those who are renting, especially when the HDB itself is the landlord in play. So that's where you have some of these ugly practices of the private landlords that may not apply, and people also worry about the ability to stay for the longer term. So it need not be rents for 1 year durations, 2 year duration. It could perhaps even be a longer form of a rental duration. It could be even 5 years with the option to extend. And I think this is something, a level of flexibility that only the HDB will be able to accord rather than, say, leaving it to the private market.
And if we look at the existing options now, for instance, if you look at the flexi housing, a lot of them are smaller footprint and they in fact have shorter durations. But we don't in fact see that with this stock of housing that there's a significant difference in upkeep and maintenance and even the pride that people have in living in the medium term in these houses. So I think what really needs to happen is a bit of a mindset change among our population to accept the fact that public housing can in fact be a very viable option, a very attractive option financially, but also from a personal perspective.
And it's also encouraging to note that, especially after COVID, we have heard of a lot of Singaporeans actually going to some of these co-living operators or even exploring renting from the open market just to be able to have the space of their own younger Singaporeans. So by allowing for a much more diversified set of housing options for our fellow Singaporeans, especially the young, I think who are much more open to such experiences of renting rather than buying per se, I think that's something we should definitely explore in the near term.
Perhaps one way to sum up all the 4 proposals that we have made is that ultimately what we want to put on the table is a greater degree of flexibility, just giving Singaporeans many more options rather than be stuck with the few cookie-cutter ones that we already have, and to push the boundaries of the existing options so that we can maximize the flexibility and hence the perceived value that Singaporeans have in their homes.
So if you want to know further about our proposals, I think we have elaborated at length about it in our housing paper, as well as in the various speeches that various MPs have put forth in the parliamentary debates earlier this year. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot.